So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the fourth and last event of the Evidence Matters campaign. My name is Vanessa Sung. I'm the Interim Executive Director at Evidence for Democracy, or E4D for short. For those of you who are meeting us for the first time, we are the leading nonprofit organization promoting and advocating for the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making in Canada. We use original research, issues-based campaigns, and skills training to empower the science community, equip citizens to better interact with evidence, and cultivate public demand for evidence-informed decision-making. We do this because we believe that we all benefit when governments make decisions informed by the best available evidence. You can find more information about our work at our website, evidencefordemocracy.ca. My colleague Nana will drop a link in the chat so you can check that out. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, which is located on the traditional and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Let's all take a moment to recognize the benefits that those of us who are settlers experience as a result of historical and continued colonialism on these lands, and reflect on how we can do our best to stand in solidarity with those who were here first. Today's conversation is going to be all about science advice, so I wanted to take a minute to spotlight Dr. Merle Ballard, who last October joined Environment and Climate Change Canada to head up the new Indigenous Science Division. Dr. Ballard is Anishinaabe from Lake St. Martin First Nation and assistant professor in the Faculty of Science at the University of Manitoba. I encourage you to check out this great video, which Nada will drop the link in the chat as well, of Dr. Ballard speaking about Indigenous knowledge holders being the first responders to ecosystem change and how that informs her approach to her research. Okay, so a few housekeeping items. So for this session, we did invite folks to submit their questions in advance, and thank you very much to those who did. The Q&A function is still available to you, so you can submit questions there today. And if we have time, we will try to get to those as well. The chat function is enabled. We've seen some really rich engagement happening in the chat during our previous Evidence Matters sessions. So we continue to encourage respectful discussions and resource sharing in the chat today as well. We have closed captions enabled as well, so feel free to turn that on if you'd like. And finally, we are offering a live French translation today. So if you would prefer to follow along in French, you can navigate to the bottom of your screen and change your stream to the French stream to follow along in French. So as you know, E4D has been running an education and engagement campaign called Evidence Matters all through March. And the goal has been to help build a common language of science and empower the Canadian public to effectively use evidence to inform their decisions and to hold individuals and organizations accountable for the claims that they make. To this end, we have developed a number of resources that are available on our campaign page, evidencematterstome.ca. The link will be in the chat. Everything is available in English and French there. And we've held a webinar and two really awesome panel discussions on the role of evidence in society and civic engagement. You can find those recordings on our campaign page as well. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their generous support that made all of this Evidence Matters work possible. Now, today is a very exciting day for us, not because it's the last day of Evidence Matters, but because it is our inaugural Evidence Day, the first of what we hope will be many annual days when we encourage public conversations about the role of good evidence in decision-making and in democracy. And for our first ever Evidence Day, we are delighted to be talking to Dr. Mona Nemer, Canada's Chief Science Advisor, someone whose job description includes advising on ways to ensure that scientific evidence is considered in government policy decisions. Now, before we bring Dr. Nemer on, we wanted to do a little quick poll to gauge how familiar our audience today is with the role of the Chief Science Advisor. It's not a quiz, it's just for fun, but go ahead and pick an option for your response to the question, how familiar are you with the role of the Chief Science Advisor? And we'll see where we are. Nada, once most people have responded, feel free to just throw up the result. Okay, this is great. So we have a really great spread of knowledge about the role of the Chief Science Advisor. We have some people who already have good understanding, but also lots of people who are here to learn more. And that's great. And you're in the right place. So let's bring on Dr. Nemer. There she is. Okay, so before becoming the Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Nemer was Professor and Vice President of Research at the University of Ottawa and Director of the school's Molecular Genetics and Cardiac Regeneration Laboratory. She holds a PhD in chemistry from McGill University and did postdoctoral training in molecular biology at the Institut de Recherche Clinique de Montréal and Columbia University. Dr. Nemer has represented Canada in numerous international science forums, is a globally recognized champion of Canadian science, and is the recipient of many national and international honors. She was first appointed Canada's Chief Science Advisor in 2017, reappointed in 2020, and again in 2022. And for those of you who read my bio, which admittedly is much less impressive than Dr. Nemer's, you'll know that before joining Evidence for Democracy, I started my science policy career in the Office of the Chief Science Advisor as a policy analyst. So it's a real treat for me today to be sitting opposite Mona while she's in the hot seat. So welcome, Mona. Did you want to say a few words to start?
Eh bien, bon après-midi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to the conversation. Don't want to use up any time away from our plan.
Great. Well, let's get right into it because we had a lot of questions from the public for you. So let's start with the basics. As we saw, many in our audience are not yet familiar with what a Chief Science Advisor does. So can you tell us, in your own words, what your role is in the Government of Canada?
Well, my role, I would say, involves three separate areas that are interlinked nonetheless. One is providing advice to the Prime Minister and his cabinet to ensure that evidence is considered in decision making. The second one is to provide advice on enhancing the science ecosystem in Canada. And the third is to promote science and encourage dialogue between scientists and the public in general. And we saw how important that was during the pandemic.
Yeah, and we'll probably spend the most time talking about the science advice part of your role today. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that entails?
The science advice function? Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I'll give you maybe an example or a couple of them, because that will make it easier to see what does it mean actually to provide science advice. So one of the first thing that the government asked me to do in terms of science advice is to provide advice on the use of science for the management of aquaculture. So I brought together a committee of experts and basically looked at how we can enhance the use of science for the management of aquaculture. More recently, of course, in the past 3 years, lots of work on the pandemic, and our last report that came out just a few weeks ago on the management of the post-COVID conditions, or better known as long COVID, in terms of providing evidence, a summary of evidence. What do we know? What should we know, but we don't know? And how to go about getting more information, but at the same time using existing evidence to address this very important issue.
Your office was very busy during the last couple of years and was really very involved in Canada's COVID response. And we'll definitely come back to the topic of COVID because, you know, perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the questions that were submitted by the public were around COVID. It's definitely still something that's very much on people's minds. But before we get there, so the role of the Chief Science Advisor is not unique to Canada. Many other countries have some sort of science advisor at the level of the national government. So how does your role compare to your counterparts from other countries?
Well, as you said, many countries actually were ahead of Canada in terms of having and using a chief science advisor. So I'm thinking here of the United States, for example, where there has been a presidential science advisor who's also the head of the office of the White House Office for Science and Technology Policy. In the UK, since the Second World War, there's been a chief science advisor reporting to the Prime Minister and the equivalent here of the Privy Council, so central within government. In Australia, there is a chief science advisor that reports to the Minister of Science. In New Zealand, there is a chief science advisor reporting directly to the Prime Minister. The European Union had a science advisor, then they replaced it by actually a committee with a chair to have broader perspectives. Other countries are actually instating now a science advisor. So Japan just put to a science advisor for the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Italy as well. So I think that during the COVID pandemic, many countries realized actually they could have used the services of a science advisors, and they've gone about finding a way to do it. The fact that there were science advisors around the country, actually India has a science advisor, other countries have the equivalent of a science advisor, sometimes it's the president of the national academies. So during the pandemic, it was invaluable actually to have this network because we regularly interacted with each other and we benefited from each other, since countries that saw the earlier waves actually provided real-time advice for the rest of us and vice versa eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was going to be a follow-up question of mine, which was, you know, do you all talk to each other? And it's great to hear that during the pandemic, you all were in frequent contact. Moving forward beyond the pandemic, are there plans to continue meeting on a regular basis on kind of other urgent science-related issues that we're facing?
Yes, for sure. And I just like maybe to remind everyone that it's actually the science, the group of science advisors during the pandemic that asked the publishers and the researchers to make sure that the research on COVID was publicly available as soon as it was basically published, something that all publishers have actually accepted, and researchers. And we also how important it was to have open science during the pandemic, which encouraged collaborations and so on. So, but beyond that, the science advisors working together, we've been encouraging and making sure that there is more science and science advice that's present in international fora. For example, like the climate climate meetings every year, known as COP, whether it's the biodiversity or the climate change ones. This is really something that's very important. Then there are bilateral or smaller groups, if you want. So, for example, the Five Eyes, Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, and the UK. We meet regularly, and then there are bilateral, of course, as well meetings. So yes, it's a very well-knit community, and we see the complex challenges ahead in terms of the green, the green economy, clean tech, you name it, of course, adaptation to climate change. So we're all trying to work actually together.
That's great to hear. This campaign is called Evidence Matters, and today is Evidence Day. So let's talk a little bit about evidence. Can you tell us about how you use evidence in the work that you do? And by that I mean, where do you get evidence from? How does your team evaluate it? And how do you use it to inform the science advice that you provide?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question because, of course, no science advisor, no person is an expert in everything. And very often people ask me, well, how do you go about advising government on a subject that you're not an expert in? And really like to point out that science is about the science method. It's about asking the question about what's the problem that we're trying to solve, having a methodic way to go about it, knowing how to collect the evidence, and the quality of the evidence is, of course, very important. The quality of the evidence, how often we have actually been able to find the same evidence in different contexts, and if not, what are the variables, and summarizing all this. So what I usually do is I would bring together experts in the field that we're talking about. So during the pandemic, I brought together a group of experts, and they were multidisciplinary from the get-go. So there were virologists, of course, there were infectious disease, but there were also behavioral scientists, there were mathematicians who were doing modeling. And my role is really asking the sort of tough questions or challenging questions to the committee, and really getting them to provide us with the strongest evidence, whether it's published evidence or if it's unpublished, like during the pandemic, and making sure that at least it's vetted by other experts on the committee, who is sort of, peer review challenge function. So this is very important. And the whole issue about the quality of the evidence, as you know, Vanessa, is super important. And it's something that we have actually worked hard to provide guidance for the government in terms of how do you evaluate the strength of the evidence. But I would say that by and large, I rely on experts, but I also ask them tough questions and challenge them to make sure that we have coherence and we have something that everybody agrees on.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you rely a lot on the expertise that you kind of bring in from the scientific community in Canada. Is that something that happens in the rest of government as well?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that it's expertise from Canada, but also elsewhere internationally. If we don't have the experts, or if we don't have enough of them, in Canada, or if we think they're in any situation of conflict, then for sure we will reach out to international expertise. And during the pandemic, I think the community has responded in a remarkable ways. I don't think that we were ever turned down, and very often, at 48-hour notice, people really rose to the challenge and helped us. So that's really important to mention. It wasn't a usual thing for government. It was actually quite unusual to have all these experts weighing in. Doesn't mean that government doesn't have science advice. In fact, I often say there is too much of it rather than not enough. And of course, too much of a good thing is just, as challenging as not enough of it, because then you can have potentially opposing advice. And at times you may get only one view. So it's very important for the science advisor actually to be both a sort of convener of all the evidence and then a synthesizer and interpreter of this evidence for government. Just throwing science at government doesn't cut it.
Yeah, it definitely just kind of becomes noise that is not actually useful for policy or decision making. Now, you were first appointed in 2017. Prior to that, there was no science advisor at the national level for quite a few years, I think a decade. So there must be, other forms of science advice that's provided, or other pathways through which evidence can flow to decision makers. Can you tell us a little bit about those pathways?
Yeah, there are a number of pathways. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily used equally effectively by governments everywhere, or by successive governments in this country. So, for example, we have our national academies, the Royal Society of Canada, that was very active during the pandemic. They put out some really excellent reports with advice. Previously, they also put out a number of advice based on expert committees, not necessarily at the request of government, but nonetheless, it was there. Government can request advice from learned societies or associations of scientists in a particular field, but also many government departments, the science-based departments, they have scientists, and the expectation is that the scientists are weighing into policy. So, but that's something that I think that we have to continuously pay attention to and make sure it's functioning properly, because it's just so easy to have silos, even between science and policy within the same department or agency of government.
Yeah, and on that point, part of your mandate actually is to assess and recommend ways to improve the existing science advisory function within the federal government. Have you been able to make progress on this? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think so. I think we've made some progress. As you know me, I'd like to see more progress faster, but we're going in the right direction. So one of actually there were a couple of things that we did very early on in my office. One was to actually provide a science integrity policy, which is super important, because we talked about the evidence and the science and the objectivity also of the science advice. So I think that was something that's very important, that's been adopted by all science-based departments. We also provided a roadmap for open science because there's nothing like transparency in terms of your evidence. So that was another thing. And then we recommended to government that that each department, actually, or most departments, have an embedded science advisor. And I'm really pleased to say that there are 9 departments and agencies now that have a science advisor. So we have one at environment, but we also have a science advisor at transport. So that's super important because it allows us to have a network of science advisors that have different expertise, and it allows the department also, you know, to have the proximity of a science advisor who can help them connect with the outside world, help them connect with other science advisors and the rest of the science advice system. Because these days it's hard to imagine a single policy that does not require science advice from and the involvement of different departments and different sectors, right? So so that's something that we're very pleased about, and we hope to continue embedding more science advisors in other government departments.
I think most, if not all, the departmental science advisors that are in place right now are in a department or agency that is more or less science-based. I mean, transport is like sort of, but I mean, you can see where they would be using science and technology. Do you think we need science advisors in kind of very traditionally not considered to be science-based departments and agencies as well?
Well, I mean, look, it's hard to imagine a department that does not require science advice for the policies that they put forward. And of course, by science, we mean evidence that is coming from Western science, all areas of science, whether it's behavioral, physical sciences, medical sciences, but also from community-based knowledge. So indigenous knowledge is very important. So when you have this broad view of science and evidence, it's really hard to imagine a place that doesn't need a science advisor. I mean, take the example of the Justice Department, or example of foreign affairs, of GAC, or the example of international trade or public safety. There's just like so much need for not only the sort of technology intersecting with the society, but also a lot of the behavioral sciences, understanding, you know, what works, what doesn't work, in terms of community safety, in terms of achieving the objectives of, you know, the legal system. So I'm really hopeful that that other departments will also come around and see the need for a science advisor, but it's work in progress.
And, you know, I'm sure it's also about kind of introducing a diversity of perspectives into the different, you know, types of policymaking in the different departments, right?
Diversity of perspective is super important, and you know, it's about cultural, it's about gender, but it's also about you know, expertise. So it's super important. We know this is you know, the best way to tackle policy, and you know, we just like need to go about it methodically.
So in my intro, I mentioned the phrase evidence-informed decision-making a number of times, and basically what we mean by that, generally speaking, is that just that decisions, in this case, government decisions, should be made based or informed by the best available evidence. it seems kind of obvious and simple, but in practice, it's not so black and white, right? Scientific evidence is often only one of the factors that are being considered by policymakers when they make their decisions. So, as a science advisor, how do you approach your advisory role with that in mind?
Well, first of all, your approach is with great humility. Knowing that you're one voice, you're providing one set of important input, and really hoping that it will be taken properly into consideration. But as you said, many things go into the decision making, and there's a lot of course, political voices, and people very often think about those. But there are also things like legality of certain things, whether we can or cannot do them based on the existing laws of the land or our international treaties as well. So there are a number of things that go into the decision making. And I think the most important thing really is if we want to enhance the input or the weight for evidence and science advice, is to make sure that we have the proper understanding between the policymakers and the scientists and the science advice, because it's like it's the questions that is asked. So science doesn't tell you you can or cannot do something. Science tells you what will happen if you do something. And understanding this, then people will ask different questions, right? And then you can push science advice as much as you want, but if you don't have the proper receptor capacity to incorporate the science advice, into their work, then your science advice is not going to go very far. So I say this because it's not enough to have like a science advisor. It's not enough to have science advisors in departments and for government to say we're following the science. I think that we need to improve the capacity within government, and for that matter, with the public, of understanding what science advice is and is not, and what kind of questions you ask from science to weigh into your sort of risk matrix in a way, and then get the ultimate answer for what you need to do in terms of the decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a complicated space. A lot of questions that we received when we put out the call about, ask the science advisor your questions, were kind of along the theme of, here is the evidence for this, and here's the policy that the government has decided on, and it just doesn't match, right? And like you said, sometimes it's about communication, sometimes it's about having the right people in government who are able to receive the science advice. But, from an outside perspective, what levers are available to kind of influence decisions, and for things like climate change, I think everybody more or less sees the same, accumulating evidence for decades now, but they still see, governments not acting proportionally to the urgency of the issue. So, what can science advisors do? What can those of us on the outside do?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of lessons that we have learned. I hope that we have learned from this pandemic, and I don't want to sort of look backward, but rather forward, and say, make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes, and make sure that we have learned from things. And I would say, like, everybody has stake in this game. The public, and that's one of the good things about the pandemic, that the public became very interested in science and started demanding the evidence from the policymakers. And I think this is extremely important. If the public continues to demand transparency around the scientific, not basis, but the science that actually weighed into the policy, I think this is going to, I mean, we are in a democracy after all, and the politicians will just have to respond to the public demand. So the public actually has a lot of power in this. I think that we need also to realize that we started in a place that was not very comfortable in terms of science literacy, whether for the government or the public. And I think that's something that we need to really work hard at. Science is, and I just said it, is a process. And I think if we explain this sufficiently well, I have every confidence that the public will understand. And this was one of the problems during the pandemic at times, that governments underestimated the ability of the public to understand uncertainty or appreciate uncertainty. So, for example, of course, the example that everybody has on their mind is about the masks. Masks are not good, then masks are compulsory. And the reality is, at the beginning, maybe the public health guidance around masks had more to do with the availability of masks and not really about whether or not masks actually will protect you. So if we had just gone ahead and said this, I think that the public would have understood that we need to keep the available masks for the healthcare workers first, and then when we get them, then everybody should be masking, and so on. But instead, we just gave edicts without any transparency into the basis for what we were providing in terms of guidelines. And I think it's clear to everyone that that's not best practice, and that's not the best way to maintain public trust about what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. You just provided me the perfect segue into my next question, which in fact is about public trust. And you have already kind of started to touch on this, but I did want to ask you about communication with the public around kind of information and evidence about COVID-19 over the past couple of years. And COVID-19 was by far the thing that we received the most questions about. And it makes sense because, never before has the public, everyone been collectively so aware of evidence in action, seeing the direct line between evidence to policy. And there's some analysis coming out now that the ways that governments have communicated with the public really hurt public trust. And you touched on a few of those things already. Can you kind of provide broader reflections on the lessons learned here in Canada and what, if anything, we're doing to kind of improve and prepare for the next, big emergency, because, COVID's not going to be the last public emergency that we face.
No, unfortunately not. And I certainly hope that we'll be better prepared next time. Look, I think that we can, in terms of communication and public trust, we can see two phases during the pandemic, at least. The first one, when it started, clearly we didn't know enough or anything about this new virus. We didn't know how it spreads. We didn't know, much. And I guess, government provided public health advice based on knowns and mostly unknowns. And the knowns were how other pandemics were managed. And the unknowns was about this particular virus. I think that the public, by and large, trusted government and complied with these measures. I think the problem started when later on, when we started, learning more about the virus, when we started learning more about how it spreads, when we started learning more about how we test for the virus, how we can avoid communicating it to others. But it's as if the communication didn't change, didn't adapt to this new knowledge and to the fact that the public, was in lockstep almost with the progress of the science. Like, it was incredible. People were talking about PCR testing. They were talking about mRNA. They were talking about cellular immunity. I mean, this was like we managed in few months to increase science literacy in very complicated fields. But it's like it just like continued. The communication continued the same, and the public was saying, well, show me the evidence. And in many places they were saying, like, this is too complicated, you're not going to understand it, so trust me. So there was a little bit of this paternalistic attitude. And of course, it couldn't go on and on, because at one point, people have to make decisions for themselves. And you have to empower them with the tool and the knowledge and the know-how so they can, make those decisions. And we do this every day. We make decisions. We weigh, the evidence about risks of, going to a certain place, risks of, engaging in certain behavior. So this is where there was a disconnect. And I think this is a huge lesson for us about the importance of transparency, about not underestimating the public, but also for the public about their power in a democracy, of making sure that, their voice is heard. So I really hope that we're not going to forget these lessons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I hope so too. And it was really astounding. Like you said, I have a research background as well, and the technical terms that we were using in the lab all of a sudden became, everyday vernacular for everyone. And scientists became household names overnight. So there was just this surge of like interest and engagement people wanted to know, like, what's the latest evidence? Why am I being asked to do this?
And you mentioned climate change and the climate crisis. I mean, the pandemic lasted 3 years. We're not even out of the woods yet, but climate change is going to be with us for years on and years on and years on. So I think it's very important that, from the get-go, we establish the sort of proper dialogue and understand the expectations of the public, but also put in place the processes that will make sure that science advice is provided sort of seamlessly, automatically, and that the evidence is also provided when government, makes decision on our behalf. So I think that this is really something that's very important for us to keep an eye on, and for the public to keep an eye on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the single question that we received the most interest on was about aerosol transmission of SARS-CoV-2. This continues to be something that folks really, really have a lot of interest in. Your office, put out a report on aerosols in the context of SARS-CoV-2 transmission, and provided recommendations around improving indoor ventilation very early on. But I think that the feeling has been that public health officials around the country have been slow to respond to the evidence around aerosol transmission, if at all. And that lack of cohesion has led to a lot of confusion and often outdated public health guidelines. So the question was, what do we do when the misinformation is coming from the official sources that we're supposed to be trusting?
Well, I mean, the air quality and aerosol transmission, I think is gonna go in the books for the things, how to better do things. And I'll say a couple of things around it. First of all, people, didn't appreciate the role of science and science advice versus public health guidance. So public health guidance and advice needed to incorporate the science, but also other elements like economics, availability of tools, whether cost benefit, for example, of certain measures, etc. So this was and is the role of public health, is to receive the scientific evidence from the experts, incorporated in what they're going to provide in terms of guidance. And in this case, it was doubly complicated because to understand aerosol science and transmission of a virus through aerosol, you actually needed to have multidisciplinary teams. You needed to have environmental scientists, aerosol actually engineers, they exist, together with virologists, together with respiratory experts, and really weigh in on the evidence. Well, that wasn't, the natural thing that happened. We did it in my office for our report. And this is when we realized that actually it's a sort of, there is two groups within the public health experts, one that believes in the aerosol transmission, one that doesn't believe in the aerosol transmission. But when you scratch the surface, you realize that a lot of this is actually historical. A lot of it is based on arbitrary definition of what, the size of aerosol. It's based on preparedness or management of influenza virus, not coronavirus. So a lot of things that are taken for granted, but actually, don't actually measure up to strong science and evidence. So it was a case where you needed to analyze what's out there, assess what is actually good evidence, what is not, and separate myth from reality. So that was quite something. And then the evidence was, in my view at least, and in the view of many, very, very clear. Why is it that public health took time, to do it? Most likely because they were worried about, availability of masks for everyone. They were concerned about being able or unable to provide protections in certain settings, like at schools or somewhere else. I don't know. I can't explain it. I think they would need to explain it. But, what I guess I just tried to explain is that there are a lot of myths out there, and it takes a lot to distill reality from sort of, fiction or anecdotes. And this is where strong evidence and strong science is essential, and where you need to have people who sift through it, and then provide objective advice that, and then, public health can do with it what they want, governments can do with it what they want. But the evidence was overwhelmingly on the presence of aerosol transmission. And even if, it wasn't as strong as people would have wanted to believe, I think that in a case like this, there is the precautionary principle that also needs to apply. So people have to explain, why they didn't adopt these known principles.
Yeah, I want to stay on this just for a little bit longer and talk a little bit, or ask you a little bit about the difference in messaging and in actions that we were seeing kind of across the country. So a refrain that we often heard throughout the pandemic from every government, every public health in every jurisdiction, was that we're following the science. It's kind of hard to reconcile that phrase with the fact that every province was doing something a little different, and they weren't always aligned with, the recommendations that were being made at the federal level. So how do we prevent "we follow the science" from becoming kind of another phrase that the government says that starts to mean very little?
Well, I think that first of all, transparency is very important. I think providing the science that was used is very important to start off with. But in terms of different jurisdictions adopting different recommendations or guidelines, I mean, you could understand it if and when the transmission was very different in different places, when the hospital capacity was different from one place to the other. I think what was lacking the most was the framework and understanding, a public understanding of the framework that was being used to provide public health guidance. So, people weren't being told, look, we're gonna, lift the lockdowns when, hospital capacity is this, when we can care for people who have COVID while we care for people who have other diseases, when we can afford to have not more than that percentage of people in classrooms absent, etc. So there was very little of this. I'm not going to say none of this, but there was very little of this. And there was, things like we're going to lift certain restrictions by this date. And dates should not have been the targets. The targets should have been the principles, right? The why. Why are we changing direction? And this, that framework should have been understood by everyone. And then, how different jurisdictions then, their acceptance of risk, their tolerance to certain things vary. People could understand this. But it's that frameworks and the transparency of both the principles and the evidence that were being used. Because it wasn't only the science per se, like as in the coming out of research labs or elsewhere, but it was also data. Data coming out of knowing, for example, where transmission was happening, data about really what was happening in different places, what is worsening outcome, etc. So, and I think this is a huge lesson about the importance of data, the transparency of the data, and of the sharing of the data.
Yeah, I think that's so important. The transparency piece, we keep coming back to it. People are smart. People were really engaged over the past few years, and they just want to know the rationale for things changing, and folks can understand if you just explain it to them, if you show them the evidence. So that transparency is so important for building trust. We're getting close to the end here, but I did want to ask you, you are in your third term now as Chief Science Advisor. I think there's about a year and a half left in your current appointment. You've been in this position for 5.5 years now. What's the biggest lesson that you've learned? Maybe something that really surprised you?
Well, I've learned that we can't take science for granted. I've learned that we can't take for granted that science speaks to policy, or that policy will seek science. So we need to constantly work on processes that will make sure that these things happen, and then that they happen, that it's as normal as possible to request science advice. It's amazing how institutions and people have tendencies to silo themselves from others. So, and one of the things that my office does is really to try to convene, to bring people from different departments, from different sectors together. You mentioned that we didn't have science advisor in this country for a long time. My strongest wish is for this position to become a permanent fixture of the Canadian ecosystem, policymaking system. I think during the pandemic, we saw how important it is. One thing that I'm working hard on is to provide advice for science advice during in preparation for disasters and in response. So I think that's something that is also one of the lessons learned from the pandemic, that crises are no time to start building relations, to start looking for evidence, to start looking for data. So we need to be prepared for this ahead of time. And then when crises happen, we need to have also the reflex of incorporating science advice right away in the operations, as we go forward. So this is really what I'm working very hard on doing, and making sure that I leave the office knowing that science advice and the next science advisor is not going to be another, struggle for the entire country, but a normal thing, just like any other position.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to pick up on something that you said just now, which is that, in fact, the role of the chief science advisor is currently not a legislative position, which means that, if there were a change in government, or if priorities change for the current government, the role could be eliminated, and we could be without a chief science advisor again. So folks on the call, if you value, science advice at the highest levels of government, make sure you let your representatives know, and talk to the people in your lives about it. Well, Mona, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today and being so generous with your time, and for being a champion for science and for evidence. And yeah.
Well, thank you for having me, and congratulations on everything that you guys do at Evidence for Democracy. I think it's we really need to all work together. This is a team effort to enhance the use of transparent and strong evidence in government, because that's in the best interest of everyone.
Absolutely. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. I hope you found this session interesting and helpful, and that you learned something. And even though this concludes our Evidence Matters campaign, we hope that you'll continue to engage with our content, seeking out and critically thinking about the evidence in your daily lives, and that you'll continue to have conversations with your friends and family colleagues about the importance of evidence in our democracy. One last very quick thing, you'll receive a feedback survey after you sign off. We love feedback, so please take a moment to fill that out. With that, thank you again, Mona, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Merci et au revoir.